It's extraordinary how much children have been in the news in the last few weeks. And just one day, last Friday actually, the Argus carried an edition which I hope, if you don't have, you will go and try to recover. In that edition of the Argus, there were stories about children on the front page, pages 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 14, 15, and 17. Collector's item. On the first page was the story of Michelle Matibi, a 5-year-old who had suffered severe burns when a candle fell over and set alight the shack she was in. Page 2 carried the story of the alleged turnaround in the country's crime statistics, but had the headline, 2 kids die daily. Pages 4 and 5 return to the story of Michelle, and I'll come to talk about Michelle repeatedly in the course of this talk this afternoon. On page 5 was the related story of that other burn victim miracle child, Pippi Kruger, who is the first South African to have sheets of her own skin grown in an American laboratory, grafted back onto her body. Page 6 ran the story of a burns unit at Red Cross Hospital, with statistics indicating that the average age of children in the unit was 2, that 98% of them came from underprivileged communities. On that same page was the story of the journalist Matthew Jordan. He also wrote the story earlier about Michelle Matibi. And this is the story of Matthew spending a day at Red Cross Hospital with Michelle. On page 8 was the astonishing story of the arrest of Professor Cyril Karabas at Dubai Airport for the manslaughter of a child he had treated for leukemia 12 years ago in the United Arab Emirates. Page 14 had the story of 23-year-old Pindelian Schlobel of Khayelitsha, who was sentenced to 6 life sentences for conducting a reign of terror in the township between November 2010 and October 2011, where he was finally arrested. Page 17 had a 5-inch column on the condition of Liana van Wyk, who was shot in the head during a gang shootout in Hanover Park. Now, in looking at these stories, there's wonderful kindness and goodness in several of them. The story of Matthew Jordan himself, and how he came to persuade Michelle Matibi to go through a second session of physiotherapy at the hospital, is enormously uplifting. As is the story of Pippi Kruger, and a slow but very hopeful journey to becoming a relatively healthy child. The detail and the texture of the story of Michelle recovering after having essentially been given little chance of making it is an exceptionally poignant story. Just love the way in which Matthew Jordan wrote that particular story. And I'm going to be using that story, as I say, repeatedly in the next one. And so, smile as we might at the wonderful ways in which human beings, even those who have yet to face the full complexity of the world, are able to fight against anything that seeks to hold them down. The point about this edition of the Argus is that there appears to be so much holding these kids back. None of the stories is based on or begins with children doing well. There appears to be so much in each of the stories about these children's lives and their futures being destined for, and maybe even aimed, and I use that word deliberately, aimed at a hardship. Taking all of it in, it would be hard to avoid the conclusion that the country's children are in deep trouble. But this trouble, I want to suggest to you here this afternoon, is actually more complex than we think. It's this complexity that I want to talk to in this address this afternoon. Why it's more complex has got everything to do with how we as a society, but especially we, when I say we here, you and I, how we who work with children, whose business it is to be about and around children, it's especially important that we come to understand how we approach this question of how we think about them. So the question that I'm putting in front of you is, if you like, a conceptual one. You might want to think of it as a kind of thinking moment, a thinking point. The argument that I'm wanting to put to you here, which I'd like us to engage with and which I'm very happy to talk about afterwards, is that, and this is the point, childhood is not a natural state. Okay? Childhood is not a natural state. We have decided here in modern times what the childhood experience should be. Childhood, in that sense, is what we in sociology would call a construct. We made it up. To help you understand what I'm talking about, I need to give you a few examples. The reality is that childhood, as it was understood, or as it is understood today, is very different to what it was 150 years ago. People in India think very differently to us about what childhood is. Closer to home, people in another park think very differently to what childhood means to people in Rondebosch. People in rural areas have a very different conception of childhood to those who live in urban areas. Middle-class people will never leave their children by themselves, not even to go to the shop. In working-class communities, it's the order of the day. In rural areas, children are put out to herd the cattle from the time that they are able to look after themselves. And this is the kind of life that is expected about them. So we need to be very clear that when we talk about childhood, and the way in which we come to understand it, that we're not talking about something that is given. It's not a natural thing in the sense that everybody in the world goes through it in the same kind of way. We do it differently. We think about it differently. Our ideas about these things are on the move, if you like. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't what you might call dominant ideas about what this childhood is all about. And our work, your work and my work, is defined by this dominance. Is defined by how we come at what this childhood is all about. And I don't mean to be dismissive or pejorative to all of you and to myself in saying this, but have I caused some trouble? Okay? And I'm going to say a little more about this, but the general way in which we've come to understand childhood in this dominant way, and it essentially comes out of American and Northern European kind of psychology and sociology, is that childhood is essentially a period of exemption. Children are exempted from things. They're exempted from responsibility. They're expected to grow into responsibility. We tend to treat them, I'd like to argue, as future people. They're not yet people. They're people who are about to become, and we tend to use words like that. They're not what I would call already people. And so generally, the idea, particularly, even in citizenship, and I'm going to be making a comment about the Constitution in a moment, is that we think of them as people who are going to inherit rights. There are rights, or the full rights that they're entitled to, are to come. Now, when we use this approach of children in this kind of way, we end up talking about them, and I'd like to emphasize this, we end up talking about them in very particular kinds of ways.